On March 27, 1977, at Tenerife Airport, Spain, the world's most catastrophic air accident occurred. What happened? What caused the tragedy? Pilot air traffic control. Who is responsible for this incident? Without keeping you waiting, let's find out about the accident considered the most catastrophic in the history of the world aviation industry. KLM 4805 and Fan AM 1736 Fateful Presentations. Spain. The thick fog seemed to embrace the entire space of the airport. On the runway at that time was a series of planes waiting to take off. This situation happened because in addition to the domestic flights of Tenerife, there were also many flights diverted from the international airport Gran Canaria. Because there had just been a terrorist bombing there had injured one person. Boeing 747, the largest passenger aircraft in the world, at that time the first Boeing was the 747-121 operated by Pan American One Airways. On flight number 1736. It had just landed after a long journey from Los Angeles. On the plane there were a total of 380 passengers and 16 crew members. The captain of the flight was Victor Grubbs, 56 years old. He was an experienced pilot with 21,043 flight hours. Most of which were on Boeing 707s, as for the 747 he had only recently switched to this aircraft. And only accumulated 564 flight hours. The first officer was Robert Bragg, 39 years old. In addition to the flight crew there was an engineer, George Warnes, 46 years old. When informed of the incident in Gran Canaria, the crew of Pan Am Flight 1736 requested a go-around to return to land. But the terrorist situation there was not yet fully under control, so the airport refused this request. Parked right in front of the Pan Am plane was a more advanced version of the Boeing 747-206B. It was operated by the national airline of the Netherlands. Flight 4805 had a total of 235 passengers and 14 crew members. The crew included Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten, 50 years old. Working for KLM since 1951, he was considered a role model for pilots. Thanks to his good hearing, strong spirit and experience, he had accumulated 11,700 hours of flying time before. With 1,545 hours of flying time on the Boeing 747. The first officer was Klaus Mers, 42 years old. He joined 4,805 as a supervisor and learned how to fly a 747 from the captain. The crew also included a flight engineer, Willem Scherutter, 48. Due to the structure of Tenerife Airport, there is only one small runway, and one large runway running parallel, connected by 4 small runways. Having to handle so many giant planes at the same time, the airport quickly became overloaded. The small runway can no longer be used to guide the planes. Instead, planes wanting to take off must perform the backtrack technique. That is, run on the runway and then turn back to take off. And this accidentally became the source of the tragedy. 502, the Pan Am was also instructed by the air traffic control tower to run behind the KLM on the runway, then turn to the 3rd small taxiway to get to the 5th large taxiway parallel to the runway. There, Pan Am 1736 had to stop to wait for the KLM to take off before it could take its turn. Because the signal was too weak, the crew did not hear ATC's request clearly at first, which was taxiway number 1 or 3 because 1st and 3rd have similar pronunciations. The first officer of Pan Am asked again, ATC please repeat which runway number 3. 1, 2, 3 number 3. After the call, the captain began to slow Pan Am down the runway. In the fog, the crew had a hard time identifying taxiways C1 and C2. But they could not identify taxiway C3 because the paint on the sign on the guide was almost faded. Weather probe, but not allowed to calibrate. Since they had reached the end of the taxiway, the captain decided to make a 45-degree turn onto taxiway C4 that they saw on the side of the KLM flight at 5:04 a.m. It had already gone all the way down the runway and was returning. At this time outside the windshield fog covered the glass, reducing visibility to less than 300 meters. The bad weather combined with the mistakes resulted in a lot of time lost because he was in a hurry to return and leave here. He had just started pressing the accelerator, when the first officer hurriedly stopped him. "Wait, we still haven't received orders from air traffic control." "Okay," he called them. ATC KLM 4805 was ready to take off. The disturbing fact is that since they were not equipped with ground radar, air traffic controllers were forced to observe with their naked eyes. However, they could not even see the planes they were flying. Due to the bad weather, they believed that at this point the Pan Nam plane had turned onto the third runway. However, it should be noted that ATC had not yet granted takeoff clearance for KLM 4805. They had only given the flight instructions to the crew. Due to a misunderstanding of the ATC signal, the first officer replied that we would go now. At the same time, the captain also spoke in an angry voice because he had lost his patience. "Let's go." 5:06 a.m. The captain began to release the brakes. The engines accelerated, and the KLM plane glided at 260 km per hour, heading towards Pan Nam, just 400 m from the runway. In an effort to clear up the confusion and ensure that KLM was still in the right place, the first officer of Pan Nam sent a signal saying, "We are still moving on the runway." At the same time, ATC also sent a message to KLM OK. 10 seconds later, KLM began to accelerate for takeoff, and then what had to happen happened. 5 hours 6 minutes 50 seconds. The world's worst aviation disaster, a cruel fate happened. "5 hours 6 minutes 45 seconds, when he looked out the window and saw a giant iron bird flying towards him. Captain Victor Grubbs shouted, 'Damn it, who the hell is this? Get out of here quickly.' With all his might, Captain Grubb tilted the rudder in an effort to bring the plane towards the runway meter. To avoid causing a collision, meanwhile Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten on the KLM, when he saw the Pan Am, he understood that now it was too late to stop just 5 seconds later. The two giant Boeing 747s collided, with a loud bang. The front wheel of the KLM smashed into the Pan Am's rudder. The left engine and the remaining wheel hit the upper fuselage. The right side of the Pan Am was almost torn to pieces. After the collision, the KLM was still flying for a few more seconds, before falling onto the runway and falling about 300 meters long. After the collision, the KLM plane burst into flames like a fireball. There was no way out for them. All 324 passengers and 14 crew members were killed. On the Pan Am side, the plane also caught fire a few seconds after the collision. 335 passengers, including the flight attendants, all burned to death. Those sitting in the nose of the plane, along with Captain Victor Grubbs, First Officer Robert Bragg, and Engineer George Warnes, had time to go through the hole in the fuselage, then climb down the left wing of the Pan Am. However, there was no way to help them get to the ground, because the distance between the plane and the ground was up to 4 meters. There was no other way. 70 people on the Pan Am took the risk of jumping down to escape death. The investigation concluded that the main reason for the accident was that the Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten took off before permission. This fatal mistake was because he wanted to leave as soon as possible, so as not to violate KLM's working hours regulations. And before the weather changed further. After much controversy, the Dutch national airline finally had to admit that their crew was responsible for the incident. At the same time, they agreed to pay $110 million in compensation to the relatives of the unfortunate people. In addition, there were many indirect causes. leading to the digging incident, making people unable to help but regret. Finally, large memorials were built later in both the Netherlands and the United States. To mourn and remember the unfortunate victims, and to wish them happiness in heaven.